Finding the perfect watercolor red can completely transform your painting. Some reds lean warm into orange, others cool into pink and violet, some are really bold and staining, while others stay soft and delicate. So how do you know which ones to choose? In this video, I will share 12 essential watercolor reds. As always, going far beyond simply swatching, you'll see how they work in real paintings, from botanicals and birds to lifelike portraits. Plus, we will explore the beautiful mixes they create for purples, oranges, neutrals, and skin tones. We will also cover the 4 traits that matter the most for any watercolor of your choice: light fastness, transparency, staining, and granulation. Along the way, I'll show you the only red I know that gives really strong granulation, meaning texture, and one surprising red that isn't technically red at all, but you'll definitely want to try it. It's one of my favorites. This video follows our series exploring different watercolors, the first one being watercolor blues, so check the link below if you want to see that as well. And you can also download today's swatch sheet on my Patreon to keep it as a free reference. I'm going to start with my all-time favorite red called Quinacridone Coral. Mine is from Daniel Smith, and it's this gorgeous, intense red with a touch of orange. It's fully transparent, which makes it perfect for layering and building luminous washes. From delicate bird feathers to vibrant botanicals, this color has been on my palette since the very beginning of my watercolor journey. And one of my favorite ways to use it is in floral compositions as a glowing base layer with darker pigments glazed on top, like we did in the recent lobster claw tutorial. Quinacridones are honestly my favorite family of colors. Their vibrancy and staining qualities make them a joy to glaze. And if you want to dive deeper into pigment families and learn how to build a palette that truly suits your style, I share a full guide in my new book, 101 Watercolor Secrets. As a primary red, Quinacridone Coral is also a fantastic color for mixing. You can pair it with Quinacridone Gold for glowing, warm oranges, use it in skin tones for portraits, or as a radiant accent in sunsets and landscapes. It also works beautifully in abstract work when you want a clean, saturated red or a really vibrant accent. And if you layer it up like I'm doing here for full strength, it reaches an incredible, almost glowing saturation. If you're looking for this shade and other brands, check for the color index code PR209, meaning pigment red 209. That will make sure you're getting the same beautiful coral hue. The next red I'm swatching is another staple on my palette, and it's one of the warmest reds I wanted to share with you, sitting very close to yellow on the color spectrum. It's called Scarlet Lake, and mine is from Winsor & Newton, but you may also see this pigment sold under a different name, Vermilion. No matter the brand, the pigment code is PR188, so that's the number to look for if you want this exact shade. Fun fact, Winsor & Newton actually named their version after so-called scarlet cloth, a type of fine wool fabric that was traditionally dyed a brilliant red. I reach for Scarlet Lake when I need a fresh, clean orangey red that doesn't lean brown. You can see it here on this flower. It keeps the brightness without muddying the petals. It's also beautiful for birds. I recently painted a full tutorial on bullfinches, and this color gave the feathers such a striking glow, especially against dark, moody blues and grays. Scarlet Lake is quite vivid and has a wonderful range of values, which makes it really useful for decorative projects too. For example, this cookie heart, where I build it up in layers for depth. One thing that always surprises me is how well it mixes with greens and blues. For example, when I combine it here with phthalo turquoise, the result is a gorgeous neutral that shifts and kind of sparkles with subtle variations in hue. Up close, you can see warm grays with hints of red and green peeking through. It's the kind of mix I would definitely recommend for urban sketching. Think of a warm sunset reflecting on a gray building. That's exactly the kind of mood it creates. Unlike coral, which I just showed you earlier, this pigment is semi-transparent. That means it has a little bit more coverage and body on the page. With just 1 or 2 washes, it looks light and bright, but when you apply several coats, it takes on this almost creamy, opaque quality that feels very rich and satisfying. So if you're looking for a very warm but versatile red, you'll want to give this one a try. And now we're moving on to what I consider the most surprising red I've ever worked with. In fact, it's the single most used color on my palette, but here's a twist. It isn't technically a red at all. This color is called Quinacridone Red or sometimes Quinacridone Rose, depending on the brand. But if you check the pigment code, you will see PV19, which actually stands for Pigment Violet 19. So technically it's classified as a violet, but on paper it looks and behaves just like a classic vivid red. For me, it's the ultimate go-to red for botanicals, whether I'm painting delicate roses or vibrant tropical plants. It's fully transparent, highly staining, and has that vivid brilliance that Quinacridone family of colors is famous for. I especially love applying it in layers like I'm doing here on top of my coral because it builds up such depth and richness. One of my favorite things about Quinacridone Red is how beautifully it mixes. It pairs effortlessly with almost everything on my palette, from yellows to blues. Here's an example. I combine it with coral and yellow for the Siamese fighting fish, and the blends are just stunning. It's also a fantastic choice for festive projects and holiday decorations. You can see a few close-ups here from my recent tutorials and demos. These are all available in full real-time versions on my Patreon if you like to dive in deeper. But I just want to highlight the fact that this color also gives you a wonderful range of values, meaning lights and darks. So from a very faded pink to a really deep red. And look at how strong it is as a primary mixing color. So with Phthalo Blue, for example, it creates the most vibrant purples and violets. If you're thinking of painting something like purple irises or maybe plums and grapes, this pigment is perfect for achieving those bright, clean mixes. The truth is, whenever I'm not sure which red to reach for, I almost always default to Quinacridone Red. Mine is from Core by Golden. Here you can see how it looks like when I add another glaze to push it to full saturation. It just sings. If I had to choose only one red pigment to use forever without hesitation, it would be this one, Pigment Violet 19, Quinacridone Red. The only true single pigment red in my palette that really comes close to this pure glowing red is called Carmine. I'll show you the swatch here. Mine is from Daniel Smith, made with pigment PR 176. This one is highly staining, non-granulating, and light-fast, which makes it quite dependable on paper. At first glance, Carmine looks just as vivid as that Quinacridone Red I just showed you earlier, and I absolutely love using it for botanicals. It shines especially in close-up studies of red flowers that need those bold, saturated splashes of color, like this tulip, for example. One thing to keep in mind with Carmine is something called a drying shift. This simply means the color looks a little duller once the water evaporates. All watercolor pigments, regardless of the brand, are affected by the drying shift to some degree, but in my experience, Carmine loses more vibrancy compared to Quinacridone Red. That said, I still reach for it very often. I just apply several layers to bring the intensity back. Here's another example. In these candy stripe peonies, I used multiple glazes of Carmine, and by building it up, the drying shift becomes much less noticeable. You still end up with that juicy, vibrant red, maybe not quite as luminous as my favorite PV19, but still very beautiful. I also reach for Carmine in holiday projects. Here you can see it paired with Quinacridone Coral, again layered several times to get that rich, full saturation. Now before we move on, let me quickly show you how Carmine behaves in mixes. With a primary yellow like this Quin Gold, it creates gorgeous rusty orange brown, something close to like burnt sienna but smoother and without the granulation. Mix it with blues or greens and you'll get wonderfully clear neutrals. Carmine is also often recommended as a more reliable light-fast substitute for Alizarin Crimson, the classic deep red primary that unfortunately isn't light-fast. But of course I'll show you a permanent version of Alizarin in just a minute. In summary, Carmine is a great alternative if you want that depth of color without sacrificing longevity. Now let's switch gears for a while, and the next 4 reds and pinks that I will show you are absolute classics, including one controversial fluorescent pink we often talk about on this channel. So I'm going to start with Magenta, pigment Red 122. Mine is the Quinacridone variety from Core, and it's this gorgeous, intense pink, the coolest red you'll reach before moving into violet and purple territory if you think about a color wheel. The pigment has been around since 1850s and is named after the Battle of Magenta in Italy. It's fully transparent, strongly staining, and incredibly versatile. In botanical art, I love using it for both very bold and very delicate flowers. So a saturated wash of PR 122 will give you petals that are very lush, vivid. You can layer it over and over, mixing it with other colors. But a softer, more diluted version is perfect for things like cherry blossoms or subtle pink roses. Because it's so vivid, I often use magenta with so-called charging technique, where I add splashes of it into darker colors, like on these chocolate orchids where I'm adding it into Perylene Violet. And you can find the full tutorial on charging technique and these orchids on my channel here. I will leave a link in the video description. Magenta is also perfect as a primary red in a triad of yellow, red, and blue. And if you're doing a so-called split complementary, it's a perfect cool red to try. If you want the brightest, most vibrant purples, I recommend mixing it with phthalo blue. Here I'm using phthalo blue green shade, and we're getting an absolutely stunning result. So this will be good for like iris leaves, and it's one of my favorite purple mixes of all times. Next up is Opera Pink, also known as Opera Rose. Very controversial, and I will explain why if you don't know yet. It's actually the same base pigment as Magenta, so pigment Red 122, but with a little twist. So manufacturers add fluorescent dye called rhodamine B, and that's what gives Opera its famous neon glow. The result is a pink that looks almost lit from within, so perfect for adding eye-catching accents to flowers, fashion illustrations, or anywhere you want that pop of neon vibrancy. And the catch is opera pinks are what is called fugitive pigments, meaning they're not light fast. Over time, especially if your painting is exposed to sunlight, they tend to fade. That gorgeous glow you see fresh out of the palette will not last forever, and for this reason, I don't recommend it if you're doing original artwork that you plan to sell. You can't control where the painting will hang or how much light it will get. If you are hanging it, it's best to cover it with archival quality glass. The question is always why keep it around, and that's because opera pink is simply irresistible. It mixes into glowing violets and brilliant corals in a way that no other pigment can replicate. And here I'm using it mixed with burnt sienna to create some beautiful skin tones. Most importantly, and I always stress this, if your work is meant to be scanned or printed like commercial illustrations or greeting cards, then fading isn't really a problem. Once digitized, opera pink stays just as vibrant as the day you painted it. And I've embraced fluorescent PR 122 both in my personal work and in commercial art. One notable project was painting these iconic cherry blossoms for the Royal Canadian Mint. They were featured on Canadian $8 silver coins back in 2020. So I get that my original watercolor might fade over the years, but the coin version will remain luminous. So don't be afraid to experiment with this color, especially if you're doing illustrations for so-called surface design, meaning anything that gets digitized. Let's move on to Permanent Alizarin Crimson, a modern alternative to the traditional classic Alizarin Crimson, which many artists still love, but sadly it is fugitive. So the permanent versions you'll find today are usually made with pigments like PR 177 or PR 264, and they give us that same rich, deep red, but with much better longevity. This color is a much darker and moodier version of red compared to magenta or coral. It leans cool with a subtle blue undertone, which makes it wonderful for mixing purples, deep florals, and natural skin tones. This is what it looks like when used as part of the primary color mix, and for me it plays a big role in portrait work where I can add lifelike undertones to skin or glaze it onto cheeks and lips for a very natural warmth. Because it's transparent and layers beautifully, you can build it up slowly for some dramatic effect or keep it light for delicate washes. In classic botanical art, you can use permanent alizarin crimson for roses, dahlias, red leaves, especially when you want that velvety rich depth. I love using it for red maple leaves and any sort of fall compositions. I think it's a perfect Christmas red too, so you can think of like poinsettia flowers or any sort of holiday decorations, ribbons, or glass Christmas ornaments. And in mixing, it's incredibly useful. It pairs beautifully with ultramarine for rich purples, like I mentioned I do in portraits, with burnt sienna for like earthy naturals. And here I'm using it with green for these beautiful lifelike shadows that can go on a tree or a leaf. If you're looking for classic, reliable red for your palette, something versatile enough for both botanicals and portraits, permanent alizarin crimson is an excellent choice. And next up, I'm going to show you Quinacridone Crimsons. So it's a more vivid variation of alizarin crimson, and this is actually the first convenience mix that I'm showing you today, meaning it's not a single pigment, but a blend. Mine combines pigment red 122, so the magenta we looked at earlier, with PR206, also known as maroon. And on its own, PR206 would be like an earthy scarlet brown, but when mixed with magenta, the result is much brighter and more balanced crimson. What I love is that it's less affected by the so-called drying shift, so this phenomena where watercolor you see wet on your palette stays just as vivid once it's dry on paper. You can compare it next to permanent alizarin crimson we just swatched, which tends to dull down as it dries a little bit more, and you'll see the difference right away. So for me, Quinacridone Crimson often works better than alizarin, just as a standalone red and in primary mixes, but of course it comes down to personal style. One thing worth noting is because it contains that brown leaning maroon, it will give you warmer violets when mixed with blue. So for example, here I'm adding it to phthalo blue and you can see it shifts into this beautiful eggplant violet, very different from the cooler purples and violets we saw when we were mixing magenta and other reds. And beyond florals, I also like Quinacridone Crimson for like autumn leaves, fruits like cherries and pomegranates, and especially for like darker skin tones that require that rich violet in the shadows. That would also feel very natural. Its versatility and vibrancy and also reliability, it's very light fast, makes it a great choice if you want one crimson that can handle a lot of different jobs. In the bottom row, I'm going to show you some really interesting reds, including a red made with semi-precious stones from a very unique range called Primatech, done by Daniel Smith. And we're also going to talk about mixing perfect red shadows using neutral tint. I'm going to start with a classic shade that's very common, but one that I personally don't enjoy using. I couldn't skip it because it appears on so many palettes, and I'll explain why it drives me a little bit crazy. So this is Cadmium Red Scarlet Hue, a convenience mix from Daniel Smith that mimics traditional cadmium reds without the toxicity of real cadmium. There's also a medium hue version that's a little bit cooler. This one is an orange leaning red, but not in the same fresh way as Scarlet Lake or Quinacridone Coral that I showed you earlier. For me, the cadmium version really lacks the lightness and translucency that I love in watercolor pigments, especially compared to the vivid quinacridones. But I'll be the first one to admit I'm very biased here. Because I always go after a more vibrant style, I've never really enjoyed cadmiums in watercolor form, even from top brands like Daniel Smith or Winsor & Newton. They always feel a bit heavy and flat. That said, I do love cadmiums in gouache, where that weight and opacity actually works beautifully. In watercolor, I mostly go for cadmiums, specifically this hue, for mixing greens. And here I combined it with green and a touch of gold to create a gorgeous olive color. So mixing greenery is probably my favorite use for cadmium hues, but beyond that, I don't reach for them often, but that's just me. I'd love to hear your take. Let me know in comments below if you use cadmium reds in watercolor or if you avoid them too. Next, let's look at another classic, Pyrrole Red, PR254. This is one of those pigments that almost every artist falls in love with at some point. It's a very bold, mid-range red, not too cool, not too warm, and it has a fantastic coverage. So Pyrrole Red is highly light-fast, semi-transparent, and has a strong staining quality. So once it's on paper, it stays put. It's difficult to lift. It's often described as a fire engine red, and for me, it's one of those most reliable, versatile reds that you can find on the market. And as I'm swatching it, I wanted to talk about one of the trickiest challenges when working with reds, and it has to do with shadows. Creating natural looking red shadows can be very difficult because even the most saturated red looks very bright, and if you add the wrong color into the mix, your red can quickly turn brown or gray in a very unattractive way. One of the best solutions for this is to simply use neutral tint. Neutral tint is a specially formulated pigment that you can find in most brands, and it's designed to darken colors without dulling them or changing their character too much. So when you mix Pyrrole Red or any red with neutral tint, you get this deeper, more convincing shadow that keeps the richness of the red, and you can see it in the swatch. The mix holds the vibrancy while shifting smoothly into the shadow territory. I actually have a full tutorial dedicated just to using neutral tint with different pigments, including a variety of reds, and it's one of my most popular videos here on YouTube because I think shadows are a very common challenge for us, and if you struggle specifically with creating red shadows, I definitely recommend checking it out. Now let's finally take a look at one of the most unique reds I've ever worked with. It's called Rhodonite Genuine from Daniel Smith. This color is part of their Primatech range of watercolors, which are made by grinding real semi-precious stones into pigment. The result is a line of paints that behave very differently from classic watercolors, and they're often beautifully granulating. Granulation means the heavier pigment particles settle into the paper fibers as the water dries, leaving behind gorgeous texture, speckles, and blooms. Normally, this effect is rare in reds, but because rhodonite is made from natural stone, it has that heavier feel on paper, even though the label says it's not strongly granulating. I found that if you pair this color with one of my favorite watercolor techniques called blooming, and it involves adding a drop of clean water onto a damp wash or blowing gently across the page, you can create stunning textures effortlessly. This is one of my favorite ways to paint flower petals, like this red rose I shared in the recent tutorial. So instead of endless layering or complicated blending, you can let the pigment and water do all the work for you. And it's also surprisingly fun for mixing. For example, here I've combined it with lemon yellow to create a warm sandy orange with some beautiful texture. And that's why I consider Rhodonite Genuine very beginner friendly. It gives you that dramatic result without needing advanced water control. Just paint a petal or a heart shape, add a little water while it's still wet, and watch as the pigment blooms into natural organic textures. It's pure watercolor joy. Next up is a very recent discovery for me, Perylene Red, PR178 from Daniel Smith. It's a medium staining, semi-transparent pigment that creates vivid dark washes with a clean, brilliant red-orange. To me, it's basically a perfect tomato red. It has that same strength you'd expect from cadmium, but with a lot more life to it, in my opinion. It doesn't look flat the way cadmiums sometimes can. One of my favorite surprises with this color is how well it mixes. So for example, paired with phthalo turquoise, it creates gorgeous neutrals, perfect for balancing bright compositions. And I first tried Perylene Red in my Valentine's heart tutorial, more as a decorative accent, but since then I've started using it more and more on natural subjects. Right now it's a star player in my new fall composition featuring crab apples and pumpkins. That painting will actually be our October tutorial on Patreon, where we'll dive deep into the magic of fall colors, combining Perylene Red with some beautiful oranges and of course granulating greens. And just a little teaser, in the next Swatch Out series, we'll be exploring the world of green watercolors. So don't forget to subscribe and share this with a friend who loves watercolor as much as you do.